We are back in the black hole of real estate, and I got a question the other day I thought was worth talking about. It's closing costs is the theme, topic, if you will, and who pays for what? So today we're going to talk a little bit about who pays for what side of the closing costs and what it means to you, whether you were the buyer or the seller. This is your host, Ron Wysokarski, for the black hole of real estate, and closing costs are a big thing. And when we talk about them, I like to contextualize them for each party. So maybe we'll start with the sellers. In Florida, in particular, a seller will likely pay for the title insurance to the property. They may pay some documentary stamps on the sale, and they're very likely to have a closing fee to pay the closing agent in order to close the deal. Now, if it's condo, they may also have an estoppel, which is going to be a snapshot of where the property is that day with regards to homeowners association fees, if there's any rents in place, if there are special assessments. It's going to bring everything to bear up to the front. So if there's any prorations or credits that need to take place, the closing agent can put those on a settlement statement. That would be called the ALTA these days. You may know it as a settlement statement or other things, the HUD, but whatever the closing statement is, however you want to call it, that's what's going to be on there for the seller side. And a lot of this comes about through custom and tradition, but also, especially with regard to the title insurance policy, in the Florida as-is contracts, there is a box where it could say that the seller will pay title insurance. There is also a box that says buyer will pay for it. And when the buyer writes the offer, they're going to select which option is best for them. The vast majority just say, hey, seller, pay for the title. And it's pretty much accepted and customary. There's some reasons where a buyer's agent might be willing to pay it. Part and parcel would be, we'll pay for the title insurance and then lower the purchase price by a similar amount. And for some people, tax strategy-wise, it might make sense to do that. I'd also enter into that as we're looking at the title insurance. We want to have clear title in order to have a closing. If you're a buyer, certainly you want clear title so that way you can move forward with the property and convey it when you're ready to sell without fear of some long-lost relative appearing out of literally nowhere and staking a claim on the property. So these are things that the seller is likely to pay at closing. With that, you're going to see some costs in there for tax prorations. So taxes are in arrears in Florida. And what that means is when you get the bill in 2025, it's paying for 2024's taxes, and the property appraiser set it up that way. So taxes are in arrears, and if you were to close at the end of the 5th month of 2025, then the seller would be crediting the buyer 5 months worth of taxes, so roughly 150 days worth of taxes. And then when it comes time for November, when the trim notices come out to pay the taxes, the buyer will then pay all of the taxes because they got the seller's portion at the closing. Now, with that said, if the buyer is getting a mortgage, it may actually just be in the escrow and they may not feel the money slipping through their fingers and being paid for taxes. It would be in the escrow and then dispersed through there, so they just make it to the monthly payment. And for most buyers, once they get used to the monthly payment, they're not thinking that part of it is going for taxes and insurance. Now, I mentioned insurance. That's something that's typically paid upfront by the buyer. Now, once the property is sold and on the seller side, there could be a credit after closing for unused insurance premium, but that will come like about 30 or so days after the closing. So if you're selling a house, watch your mail. Now let's flip it over to the buy side. What expenses is a buyer going to find? Well, on that settlement statement, they're going to have a closing fee. The seller has a closing fee. The buyer has a closing fee. They may have some doc stamps on the mortgage or the deed. If they're buying it and financing it, they may have the cost of a survey, a property survey. It's the boundary lines. They might also have, the cost of the elevation certificate. That's the topography to show if it's at or above sea level or below it. which could kick in for some flood insurance. And then there's homeowners insurance, where you are going to pay the first year's insurance up front, and then the rest will be done through most likely your escrow. So that's a pretty big chunk of change that gets tossed into closing. Now, there's limitations what you can put in the escrow, and it may just come to pass that there's going to be what feels like manipulation to make the number a little bit smaller to bring to closing, or a little higher if you just want all the bases covered. But either way, that you're going to realize the amount of the taxes, because you're going to feel it in the wallet when you have to remove that money and put it into a check for the closing table or a wire transfer for the closing table, whichever one that's going to be. So now that we know that the buyers and sellers each have a series of closing costs, the days of, hey, I'll give you this much if you pay my closing costs, well, not so fast. I think that offer still verbally gets thrown out there by some old school buyers, and it's maybe, truthfully speaking, it may be all they're used to. So that could certainly happen. Now, beyond that, we really want to look at some of the things that go into it. Like, for instance, the buyer is going to make an escrow payment. Some money down, it's going to go in the settlement statement. So when they put, let's say, $5,000 down, and their total down payment is $15,000 or $20,000, that $5,000 is already paid in there. So you're going to see a credit on there for the amount that you put in escrow, and that will reduce the amount of money you've got to use for your down payment that's going to happen in order to trigger the mortgage. You've got to bind the contract with some sort of a down payment, an escrow, and that's where it's going to come from. So you would subtract that from the total amount due because you paid some of it up front. We mentioned survey. We mentioned elevation certificate. Insurance is another one. Paying a year up front, and then the rest could go into escrow so it's ready for the next time around. I think that's a smart thing. Inspections. You can absolutely get a 4-point inspection. I recommend them for most people. So you get the wind mitigation form, which is absolutely something you should be looking at to save you money. And then you've got your general liability policy, which you've got to put on there. And if you're renting, you might have a renter's insurance policy or an HO6, which might cover you for loss of rent and any slip and fall type of thing. So, now we're looking at closing costs, and I've given you a few of the prepaid items, but in actuality, they're all part of the settlement process. And if you want to call them closing costs, that's great. If you want to call them settlement costs, that's great. The fact is, there's money changing hands and coming out of pockets in order to facilitate that. And I think that most people are accustomed to paying something in order to transfer the title over when the property is sold. So these are the things that I would offer to you to look at as far as who pays what. In most Florida contracts, because it's spelled out in the as-is right now, right within the contract, it gives a guide of who pays what. And I think that's the way that we should be approaching this, because the conversation of negotiation would flow from who pays for what. And if you're going to take on $10,000 or $20,000 for somebody's closing costs, you're probably reducing the purchase price. There may or may not be a tax benefit based on doing that. Maybe it's slight, maybe it's bigger, but it's absolutely something that you could do, is just split it right down the middle. It's to work with relatively common practices for which costs are paid by whom, and then get the closing. So, that's what we have. When it comes down to who pays for what on the closing costs, in most cases now, the FAR as-is contract really spells it out for people. So FAR, F-A-R, Florida Association of Realtors, BAR is the Bar Association. They combine to write these really nice contracts where the agents fill in a few blanks, and everything seems to work and flow from it. So there's a little bit about closing costs and who pays what. I hope this gives you a better idea of what is taking place. And, by the way, if you're paying cash, other than the settlement statement, you almost don't have any costs when you're paying cash in a property. Maybe a little insurance, maybe front-loading an HOA fee, maybe paying for an estoppel. That's about it. So, cash is king, and cash could greatly reduce what you have to pay for in addition to the property and the down payment. This is your host, Ron Wojciechowski, for the Black Hole of Real Estate.